A posteriori arguments for the existence of God are out for Descartes. Because remember, the only things that we can know for certain are things that are known through the clear light of reason alone. So he cannot use any of those arguments used by St. Thomas Aquinas, because they all relied on what? Sensory observations. Descartes is going to have to formulate an a priori argument for the existence of God. An argument that relies not on the senses, but upon reason alone. This argument is famously called this. It's in your book, too. It is famously called Descartes' ontological argument. And for those of you who think this word sounds a bit fancy, Dan, ontology is the area of study that's concerned with being. So if you want to understand, this argument will rely on the concept of being itself. Now, a version of this argument was actually formulated about 400 years before Descartes. It was formulated by someone named Saint Anselm. And it goes like this. The fool saith in his heart that there is no God. For God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. Now notice, we didn't say perceived, we said conceived. God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. What does it mean to have a I just gave away my answer. Stupid me. Just for something to be conceived means that one has a concept. And where does that concept exist? And just to spell it all out, concepts exist in minds. Now what Descartes says is, I have a clear and distinct idea of God in my mind. God is a being that is of unlimited perfection. Now folks, if I am thinking about a perfect being who does not exist, guess who I'm not thinking of? God. If I'm thinking of a perfect being who doesn't exist, then I'm not thinking about God. To put it to you another way, if God doesn't exist, then God can't be what? Perfect. Because in order to be perfect, you at least have to what? Exist. I mean, crappy old me exists and I'm not perfect. So what Descartes will argue is, from the concept of God, God must necessarily exist. Now, for those of you who think this argument sounds rather silly, most critics argue that his argument is this. Most critics will argue that this argument is a circular argument, because they will say you are assuming the very concept that you're trying to prove. So you really haven't proven anything. Now here's how Descartes will argue back. And by the way, if you think it's a circular argument, this will not convince you either. Now Descartes would argue that if I do have an idea of a perfect being, it couldn't have come from where? It couldn't have come through my senses, because there's nothing that I've ever experienced that is perfect. And I couldn't have just made it up, because perfection is a unique concept that a finite being like me couldn't have cooked up. Take a guess where he claims that he got his idea of God. From God. He will argue that as a result, whoops, bad smelling, he will argue that God must be an innate idea. Now, to say that an idea is innate is to say something like it is inborn in us, part of the very fabric of our mind. He contends that it is, and he makes this metaphor, he says, it is like God putting his stamp on our mind. And if you don't have a concept of God, it's because you have not opened yourself up to it. It's in there, you just have to reflect on it. And then you say, I have this idea of perfection. Yes?
What would Descartes say if God is like so great, why do bad things happen?
I was going to get there. I was going to get there. But because he actually talks about that in the next meditation, meditation 4. Now, one other thing before I leave this. He gives a couple more analogies to try to back this up. But folks, analogies are not deductively sound arguments. They are merely illustrations to help us to better make sense of it. He says that to take away the idea of perfection of God would be like taking away the idea of three-sidedness from a triangle, or taking away the concept of a valley from its mountain. Because you'll notice you can't have a mountain without a valley. Those concepts are linked to one another. Now, I will admit this argument doesn't convince me either, if I'm allowed to say it. And this is because I am what you would call a knee-jerk empiricist about things. Empiricism is the subject of chapter 10. I happen to think that the idea of blueness comes from where? Well, I experience things that we call blue, and that's how I come to know what blue is. I also happen to think that I don't have an idea of perfection, and I also know that I got my idea of God from where? The Bible stories I was told about in Sunday school. And I would contend that I never had an idea of God until I was given that instruction. In other words, it was learned in social contexts and so forth. And I suppose that if I had been plopped down on a desert island somewhere as an infant, Greystoke kind of stuff, Tarzan, I suppose that I would probably have known what if I hadn't been taught it. I don't think I would have any idea of God unless I was taught it at some point. And by the way, whenever I imagine, and I'm pushing ahead to one thing I'll talk about in the next unit. If I think about my imagination about God, his voice, if God were to have a voice, would be the voice of Charlton Heston. Because in that famous movie, The Ten Commandments, which is before most of your time, Charlton Heston not only played Moses, he also did the voiceover for God. So when Charlton Heston's voice is heard, I think the voice of God. And it was a learned experience. Now, of course, the reason why when I imagine God, I imagine a man, anthropomorphism, is because I was always taught that God was a man. Even though if you think that concept through a little bit, that's got to be rather silly. Because if God were literally a man, as our good friend J-Rock from the Trailer Park Boys would say, then that would mean that God also has junk. Stones, etc. I mean, I want this to sound just as blunt and vulgar as it sounds. So my idea of God as a big man, of course, can't make any what, really? It doesn't really make any sense. The fact is, that's probably just the way we anthropomorphize the divine to try to what? To try to make sense of things. To try to make sense of things that probably can't what? Yeah, can't really be made sense of. Now, to answer Raniak's question, Descartes does recognize, just like everybody else, that if you're going to postulate a good, perfect God, that this will come up. Descartes does deal in the fourth meditation with the problem of evil, except he will characterize it as us falling into error. So if God is indeed perfect, we might ask ourselves, why would a good God have allowed us to fall into error? And by fall into error, he's not just talking about getting knowledge wrong. He's also talking about the state of the world. Now, what Descartes argues is this. In God's wisdom and God's love, he gave us this. Descartes contends in the fourth meditation that God gave us absolutely free will. And he describes it this way. I have the unlimited ability to assent or to deny truth claims. And nobody is stopping me or forcing me. Now, by the way, we will question whether or not we actually have this kind of free will that Descartes claimed.
Doesn't this in part violate his evil genius hypothesis?
How so?
Well, if all you know is that you are a thinking individual, then couldn't the evil genius be kind of manipulating the yes or no in your mind?
Well, let me go back to something. Remember that what Descartes had shown in the first meditation was even if there is an evil genius, that evil genius couldn't confuse him about the fact that he exists. And then in the third meditation, what does he prove to his satisfaction? He proves that God does exist. And that's why kind of the evil genius hypothesis is something that he is pretty much what at this point? Yeah, he's thrown it out at this point.
Okay.
Yeah. By the fourth meditation, he has already discarded the evil genius hypothesis. He has proven to his satisfaction.
So basically you have to think about these not as a collection of arguments, but as a chronological set of arguments.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, he builds upon upon his foundational pieces as he goes through his meditations. And in the fourth meditation, he tries to deal with some of the possible objections. Now, in order to deal with why we fall into error, he claims that God gave us unlimited free will. And by the way, he conceived freedom in this sense to be a power. Because God is all-powerful and unlimited, God must have unlimited free will. Now, God, out of his love, and remember, as anthropomorphists, he tended to believe that human beings are the pinnacle of God's creation. God gave us unlimited free will, but there was a catch. We have unlimited free will, but what kind of beings are we? But we are finite beings.
It's 44.
Yeah, thank you. As finite beings, God contended that we had this. We have limited understanding. Now here's the pithy little answer to that question. We fall into error when we will beyond what we understand. In other words, we fall into error due to our own fault because we misuse our free will on things that we don't fully comprehend. Now Descartes understands, like some of you probably already do, that this certainly doesn't cover the whole gamut of human suffering. Because my use of my free will did not cause a tornado. Human acts of free will do not cause hurricanes.
They might make them worse.
Yeah. Well, they also don't cause, like, meteors to fall in the city. Yeah. Think of your natural disaster. Descartes understood that natural disasters were, what we call acts of God. Now, Descartes turns to a very unconvincing argument to try to deal with those kinds of things. He thinks that he's dealt with human error this way. But in order to deal with what we call non-moral evil, John Hick called those kind of things non-moral evil, tornadoes and so forth. He turns to the old standby. What I like to call the mysterious ways or the mysterious nature of God. To put it bluntly, we can't know why God allows like natural evils to happen. But we must have faith and understand that we can't fully comprehend God's reasons. Remember, we've proven that God is perfect. And it is arrogant for you to even think that you can understand God's reasons. However, as a perfect being, a perfect and a loving being, God must have what? Not just reasons, but darn good ones. Good ones that, in my finitude, I may not be able to understand. Now, you'll notice that if you are a skeptic, this argument is certainly not going to satisfy you. Because as our pal B.C. Johnson put it, for all we know, this God might not be the kind of God Descartes is talking about. Because his argument is unconvincing to a lot of people. And besides, how do we know God is not unleashing his terror on us for the same reason why a sadist unleashes his terror on people? You've met people who enjoy hurting people, am I right? Or you might ask the question, there's plenty of evil people in the world who are not evil due to free will. We'll talk about the mind-body problem first thing next time. But if you think of your average sociopath, the good news is sociopaths are not average. But if you think about a sociopath, do sociopaths choose to be evil or are they just evil? I would say they're just evil. Our good friend from A Clockwork Orange, how many of you have seen the movie or read the book? Little Alex, played by Malcolm McDowell. He just loves ultraviolence. It's like built into his nature. He didn't choose it. It chose him. More on that next time.